As I indicated earlier, the passage I'm reading in Luke is not the easiest to hear, but it has an important message, I think, for all of us. It tells of some Sadducees that came to Jesus and they were questioning him. They were asking what happens in a family when a brother dies and who will be married at the resurrection. Gosh, what a question. It's one of those really difficult questions to address and to answer. But we listen to Jesus as Jesus responds to them in Luke 20:34 through to 39. Jesus replied, "The people of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and they can no longer die, for they are like the angels. They are God's children, since they are children of the resurrection. But in the account of the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise, for he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living." Some of the teachers of the law responded, "Well said, teacher," and no one dared ask him any more questions. Now we're journeying through Luke's gospel, and the Sadducees, you need to understand, were very much controllers of worship at the temple. But they didn't have a perspective on the resurrection of the dead. That made them different than some of the Pharisees and other groups. And the question that Jesus is being asked, has been designed for him to ask, makes the whole thing almost ridiculous. Because here are a group of people that don't hold to the resurrection asking questions about what happens in the resurrection. And Jesus says in the resurrection, people neither marry or are given in marriage. That's a very clear statement as far as he is concerned. That's what we find in verse 35. And the emphasis of Jesus seems to be upon the living now and in resurrection. So the real issue as far as Jesus is concerned is not what happens then, but what happens now. And that's so often the case that we find and discover when we read the Gospels. He made it quite clear. It talks about Moses and talks about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. And Jesus' perspective quietens even the most engaged questioner, and some respond to the end in quite a remarkable way. I like the way that when he gives an answer to people, that you have them say, "Well said, teacher," almost as if, "Oh, we knew that was the case." Well, I think what it amounts to is summed up in those final verses in this section. And no one dared ask him any more questions, because here is wisdom demonstrated, wisdom personified, wisdom shown in the deepest way that would be very, very challenging to those who listen to him. I suppose, what does this passage have to say to us? Well, I think first of all we recognize that Jesus is the one who has all the answers in the sense of having real wisdom. I think it puts us into a place where we mustn't try and trip him up and trip ourselves up with questions that we don't have the answers to. They're not simple to ask of ourselves. And also I think it really questions the motivation for what is being asked here. It's almost as if they're trying to take Jesus off on one side, away from whatever it is that really matters, by starting to ask other questions of him. But there is something about Jesus, isn't there, in the way he responded to people, so much so that they daren't ask him any more questions, because they knew very well that that's really not going to be a good way for them. So these Sadducees, who had all the responsibility for worship at the temple, for so many religious activities, had their own views and perspectives, are trying to trip and trap, just like the Pharisees were in the New Testament. I don't get to the stage where I think we should say to ourselves, "Oh, these awful Pharisees, these awful Sadducees," but they do demonstrate to all of us that it's so easy to get off track, isn't it? It's so easy to move on to something that really is a side issue, when the heart of the matter is not what happens then, not what happens in relationships for which we have no responsibility and cannot change, but what happens with our life now. We listened earlier to somebody engaged in volunteering in the realm of counselling as a lifeline volunteer. But the truth is that whatever people do, it's what happens in this life that makes the difference. And what happens in this life is related to what happens in future life. But that's the place we must start, where people are. That's where the pain is. That's so often where the distress is. That's so often where people find themselves in a place where they need real help. And Jesus knew that. So many times in his ministry, he brought things back to the things that matter most. He brought them back to what we do today, so that what we do today and the things that matter most may impact upon the way we live life into the future. What a wonderful Saviour is Jesus, the way he handled the difficult question. It seemed like his whole ministry, he had people following him round with question after question after question. But you know, what he taught us was profound about what really matters most.